am writing this as a private report, the kind you seal in a metal box and bury under a foundation, because some stories do not deserve witnesses until the people inside them are finally safe. If you found this file, it means either I succeeded and no longer need it, or I failed and hope is now somebody else's job. My name in the world I came from was Mira Cade, and my talent was surviving bad rooms, hostage negotiations that turned into brawls, boardrooms where men smiled while signing someone's exile, and alleyways where a single mistake cost a life. I never believed in fate until the day I died in a city I had promised myself I would leave, and woke up inside a book I had never read. The book's title, which appeared as a neon banner across my vision for a heartbeat, was ridiculous in the way internet melodramas love. The Veil Air's Velvet Cage. I did not get to laugh about it for long. I opened my eyes to a ceiling painted with pale constellations, smelled disinfectant and expensive wood polish, and felt the ache of a body that was not mine. Thin wrists, a bruise on the ribs, and the faint sting of perfume that someone else had chosen. A voice without warmth ran through my skull like a file through bone. Continuity module attached. Role assigned. Step spouse. Primary objective: remain alive until target reaches age 18. A translucent interface hovered near my left hand, full of meters and a single line of currency called merit. I understood the trap quickly. This world would kill me if I behaved like the woman whose face I wore, and it would kill me if I behaved like a tourist. The mirror told me who I was supposed to be: Serena Vale, second wife of Dorian Vale, the man who owned a private security empire with contracts in half the countries that pretended not to know his name. Serena in the novel, according to the scraps the module shoved into my memory, was the perfect villain in pearls, sweet in public, poisonous in private, eager to produce a true heir and discard the inconvenient first child. That inconvenient child was Lucien Vale, 12 years old, silver-eyed, too pretty to look real, and confined to a wheelchair by a chronic condition no doctor could name in public. He would become the book's male lead, a brilliant, brutal adult who ruled the Vale network like a cold sun, and who repaid every humiliation with interest. In the original story, Serena died screaming. The module called that canon stability. I called it a warning label. Merit was limited, and the interface offered enhancements like beauty, luck, charm, resilience, and combat aptitude. The module's tutorial suggested charm first, as if a smile could disarm men who carried sidearms to breakfast. I spent everything on combat aptitude anyway, draining the merit bar until it hit 0, and the module hissed about efficiency. I did not care about efficiency. I cared about breathing. When your enemies are rich, you do not need to be prettier than them. You need to be harder to bury. The first test came at dinner, staged with the precision of a child who had already learned that adults are weak at the exact points they pretend are principals. The mansion's dining room was a cathedral of glass, bright with a chandelier that looked like a frozen waterfall. Staff moved like silent chess pieces. At the far end of the table, Lucien sat in his wheelchair, shoulders wrapped in a soft blanket, expression calm in a way that made my skin crawl. I carried him a bowl of herbal broth the staff insisted was doctor approved. He accepted it with careful hands, let the steam rise to his face, and then tipped it with deliberate grace. Hot liquid cascaded onto his own legs and splashed onto my shoes. Pain bit my ankles. He did not flinch. His mouth curved into a small glacial smile. Then, in the next breath, he threw his head back and wailed like an angel being tortured. "Father, she hit me!" Dorian Vale appeared as if the house had summoned him. He was 34, all controlled violence, with a suit cut to hide the weapons he preferred. He saw the red handprint Lucien had slapped onto his own cheek because, yes, the boy had slapped himself mid-cry, quick enough that the staff looked away and Dorian's face cooled into something like a verdict. His right hand went to his holster. "Serena," he said, and every syllable held a threat. "Are you trying to die?" The barrel touched my temple with the intimacy of an unwanted kiss. The staff froze, trained to witness without existing. Lucien sobbed with theatrical hiccups, peeking at me through his lashes to see if fear had arrived. Fear would have been reasonable. Instead, I rolled my shoulders like I was loosening before a sparring match, caught Dorian's wrist, and rotated it just far enough that his trigger finger lost alignment. The pistol came free into my hand with a smoothness that surprised even me. Combat aptitude was not a gentle upgrade. It was a rewrite of muscle memory, a brutal gift. I popped the magazine out, racked the slide to clear the chamber, and tossed the ammunition onto the table like dice. Dorian's eyes widened. Lucien's crying stopped mid-note. I kept the weapon, Because there is nothing more insulting to a man like Dorian than being treated as unsafe with his own toy. Your son lied, I said, calm as a ledger. Dorian snarled. He's a child. He is a child you are teaching to become a monster, I replied, and I did not raise my voice because volume is for people with no leverage. Lucien's gaze sharpened, the way a predator's does when something unexpected moves. Dorian lunged. I used the pistol's grip like a hammer and struck him twice on the crown of his skull. Not hard enough to kill, hard enough to teach. The sound was ugly and satisfying. Dorian staggered, hands up in reflex, more shocked than hurt. I looked past him to Lucien, who stared at me with the stunned intensity of someone watching a rule break in real time. That, I told the boy, is what happens when you set traps and forget the hunter might be tired of being polite. That night, the mansion's walls shook with gunfire. It was not romance drama gunfire, the symbolic kind. It was the heavy, rhythmic crack of automatic weapons and the glassy screams of alarms. Dorian's empire had enemies, and enemies loved vulnerable timing. Men in black tactical gear flooded the gardens like oil. Someone had chosen the night of my arrival to strike, which meant either coincidence or a plot with better planning than the book's author deserved. Dorian barreled into the library, blood on his cuff, barking orders into a radio. Lucien sat rigid in his chair, face pale but eyes bright, as if violence was the only weather he recognized. A concealed panel slid open behind a shelf, revealing a panic corridor lined with steel. Dorian grabbed Lucien's wheelchair handles and began to push him inside. Then he reached for my arm, intending to shove me into the corridor too. A convenient piece to lock away. I caught the doorframe. No, I said. Dorian's jaw flexed. You'll die out here. Then die watching, I answered, and shoved him forward instead. I forced Lucien's chair over the threshold, followed by Dorian's bulk, and then I leaned close enough that he could smell the broth that still clung to my clothes. If I keep you both alive, I said, you will sign over operational control of the estate security to me for 30 days. You will also stop striking your child as if he is a training dummy. Agree, or I leave the door open. Dorian stared like he couldn't decide whether to shoot me or admire the audacity. Behind his anger, I saw the truth. He was exhausted, and exhaustion makes even tyrants negotiate. He spat. Fine. Lucien watched us both, his expression unreadable. But his fingers curled around the wheelchair armrest hard enough to whiten. I closed the steel door, spun the wheel lock, and stepped into the corridor's shadow. Stay, I told them. Dorian tried to bark a command. I tapped the pistol's empty slide against my palm as a reminder of who currently held authority. Then I walked back out into the house's open, lit heart, where the intruders assumed the weak were hiding. I am not proud of what I did next, but pride is a luxury paid for with other people's graves. Combat aptitude carried me through halls and stairwells like a storm given bones. I used the mansion's angles, its mirrors, its ornamental pillars, turning wealth into cover. I disarmed 2 men with knives, took 1 rifle, and shut off the central lights, plunging the attackers into a maze of their own flashlights. The staff huddled in the kitchen, praying to whatever God's servants are allowed. Dorian's loyal guards were brave but predictable. I redirected them, not gently, into flanking positions. By dawn, the gardens were a mess of torn hedges and shattered stone, and the attackers had fled or been captured. Dorian emerged from the panic corridor with Lucien, both alive, both furious, both forced into an unfamiliar shape. Indebted. He looked at the subdued attackers and then at me, as if trying to compute a reality that did not match his internal mythology. Lucien's gaze lingered on my hands, on the blood that wasn't mine, and something small flickered behind his eyes, a curiosity that would, in another story, become obsession. The module chimed in my head, pleased and irritated. Canon deviation detected. Roll performance out of expected parameters. Objective updated. New objective. Maximize target affection before age 18. Failure results in termination. I laughed once, short and humorless. Survive had been hard. Be loved by a child trained to hate was cruel comedy. 30 days of control became 60. Then a year, because I did something Dorian had never done. I replaced the people around him. I offered promotions to the ones who valued competence over cruelty, and I quietly removed the ones who enjoyed cruelty for its own sake. I did not do it out of moral purity. I did it because a crew that likes pain will eventually aim it at you. Dorian noticed too late that the estate's security reported to me with the reflexive speed of trained loyalty. He tested me, of course. One afternoon, he raised a hand to strike Lucien's head because the boy had dropped a glass on purpose, and Dorian's temper loved simple scripts. I snapped a ceramic cup against the wall near Dorian's ear, shattering it into white dust. The sound cut through the room like a siren. 30 guards stepped in at my gesture, forming a loose ring. I said to Dorian, "Show your son how you break limits. Fight them. You may stop when I say stop." Dorian's eyes burned with humiliation. He fought anyway, because he could not endure being seen as weak. He lasted longer than a normal man, shorter than his legend. When he finally fell to one knee, bruised and panting, I crouched in front of him and spoke softly so only he could hear. "If you demand perfection from a child with a broken body, you are not raising strength," I told him. "You are manufacturing hatred." Lucien watched the scene in silence, his face blank, but the module ticked a number upward in the corner of my vision. Affection +1, then +0, then +0 again, as if the system itself was embarrassed by its own metric. At least the number had moved. Winning Lucien's affection did not look like hugs. It looked like giving him choices and surviving the ways he punished me for them. He tested boundaries with the patience of a scientist, spilling tea, misquoting me to staff, leaving sharpened pencils on my chair, smiling when Dorian glared at me. Each trap was a question. "Will you leave? Will you hit me? Will you become her?" I answered with consistency and inconvenient honesty. I apologized when I was wrong. I refused to grovel when I was not. I made his physical therapy non-negotiable, but never turned it into spectacle. I stopped staff from whispering about his weakness, and I replaced pity with routine. Some days he looked at me as if I was a strange animal he could not decide to adopt or kill. At 16, Lucien stood without a cane for the first time, shaking but upright, sweat soaking his shirt. Dorian looked like he might cry and then swallowed it into anger, because that was the only emotion he trusted. He ordered Lucien to walk farther, faster, as if cruelty could accelerate recovery. I stepped between them and said, "He will walk as far as he can today, and then he will rest, because bodies are not bargaining chips." Dorian's mouth opened to argue. I closed my hand around his forearm, not threatening, simply absolute. His eyes flashed, and he backed down, because he had learned by then that I did not bluff. The module reported affection +2, which felt like being paid in pennies for building a house. The biggest shift came when I gave Lucien something he had never been allowed: distance. He had attended a private tutor program inside the estate, guarded like a hostage. I enrolled him in Calder Academy, a fiercely competitive public school that prided itself on not caring who your father was, only what you could solve on an exam paper. Dorian raged, claiming enemies would target Lucien. I listened, then said, "If your enemies can reach him at a school with cameras and witnesses, they can reach him in your living room. At least at school he can breathe." Dorian tried to override me. His own staff refused to move without my signature. Lucien said nothing, but when the car dropped him at the academy gates, he paused, staring at the crowd of students and the noise of ordinary life. For one flicker, he looked like a boy, rather than a myth. When he glanced back at me, his eyes held a question he would not ask out loud. I said, "Go make your own weather." The module chimed. Affection +7. At Calder, Lucien met Hannah Sato, a scholarship student with a steady voice and the kind of warmth that does not beg permission to exist. She chaired the student council, tutored half her grade, and still carried her grandmother's bento lunches because she refused to waste love. Lucien watched her from a distance for weeks, as if warmth might be contagious. My surveillance team, because yes, I kept eyes on him, but far enough away that he could pretend he was unobserved, reported tiny details. Lucien lingered near Hannah's classroom. Lucien asked about the astronomy club. Lucien pretended he did not care when Hannah laughed with other students. One report included an unnecessarily concerned note about Lucien spending too long in a restroom, which earned my instruction to stop wasting my time with teenage biology. Hannah did not know the Veil name at first. When she did, she treated it like a fact and not a throne. That, I think, is what hooked him. Trouble arrived the way it always does in worlds built on power. Somebody tried to collect a debt from the wrong person. Hannah was cornered after school by older boys demanding money and favors in exchange for silence about a forged exam sheet. Lucien stepped into the alley with the calm of someone who has seen guns at dinner and told them to leave. They laughed until they noticed the way his eyes did not beg. A scuffle broke out anyway. Lucien did not fight like a street kid. He fought like someone trained to end things quickly, a style Dorian had taught without admitting it. Hannah saw blood on his knuckles and tried to scold him for being reckless. Lucian, in perfect Lucian fashion, told her she was too loud and should go home. She almost did, then returned with a bandage and a stubborn frown. From the car across the street, I watched them argue, and the module ticked my affection number upward again, as if proximity to Hannah warmed Lucian enough to thaw his hatred of me by association. 2 weeks later, an event happened that the novel would have treated as tragedy fuel, but that I recognized as a lever. A delivery truck jumped the curb outside the academy at dusk. Witnesses said the driver looked drunk. The driver later claimed fatigue. Lucian pushed Hannah out of the truck's path without thinking. The impact threw him across asphalt like a doll. By the time I reached the hospital, his chest was wrapped, his head immobilized, and the doctor's face was the kind that tries not to be cruel while delivering cruelty. Lucian's brain swelling was severe. They said wait and see, the way people say pray, when prayers are the only currency left. The module's voice returned, colder than ever. Target neural failure predicted within 72 hours. Objective failure imminent. I sat beside Lucian's bed and stared at his hands, long-fingered and still. Hands that had once engineered my downfall in a story I refused to follow. Hannah visited once, eyes raw from crying, and Lucian, unconscious, could not drive her away. So I did it gently, promising her updates and asking her to rest because guilt is not medicine. When she left, I confronted the module. Give me options, I said. The interface displayed an item called Vitality Stasis. Cost 200 merit. I had 0 merit, because I had spent it on being dangerous. The module suggested converting combat aptitude back into merit at a ruinous rate. It was extortion dressed as choice. If I traded strength, I would become easier to kill, and Dorian's enemies were never patient. If I did not trade, Lucian would die, and the module would terminate me, which meant either erasing me or dropping me into another hell. I pressed my forehead to the bed rail and made a decision that tasted like iron. Do the conversion, I said. The transfer felt like a hook dragged through my muscles. My body, once humming with borrowed reflexes, dulled, as if someone had poured sand into every joint. I could still fight. I could no longer dominate. The module confirmed the purchase, and monitors beside Lucian steadied by fractions. The doctor called it a miraculous stabilization. I called it buying time with my own blood. Dorian arrived hours later, eyes bloodshot, fury disguised as grief. He grabbed my collar and shook me hard enough that I hit the wall. In the past, I would have thrown him to the floor with one hand. This time I swallowed pain and stayed upright, because I needed him focused on the real enemy. Find out who hired the truck, I told him. Scream later. He stared at me, noticing the difference, and suspicion sharpened his face. What did you do? He demanded. I gave him nothing he could weaponize. Lucian woke 2 days later. His eyes opened slowly, as if returning to a world that had never offered him a reason to return. When he saw me, something in his gaze shifted, less hostility, more wary recognition, the way a wolf regards a rival that saved its life for no obvious reason. I did not tell him what I paid. I learned long ago that sacrifices become chains if you announce them. Hannah was at the door, clutching a thermos like a talisman. Lucian glanced at her, then at me, and murmured, "You look tired." It was not comfort, but it was noticing. The module sang, "Affection plus 12. Recovery made Lucian restless. He hated hospitals and the way nurses spoke to him as if he were glass. I organized private rehab, insisted on pain management, and kept Dorian away whenever Dorian's temper began to burn. Hannah visited often, stubbornly cheerful, bringing homework and gossip and small pieces of normal life. Lucian tried to chase her off with barbed comments. Hannah responded with sharper humor and refused to be frightened by his frost. I watched their dynamic and understood, with the clarity of someone outside romance. Hannah was teaching Lucian that connection could survive rejection. I was, in my own blunt way, teaching him that power could be used to protect rather than punish. The module's affection number climbed slowly into the 30s, then the 40s, never fast enough to feel safe. While Lucian healed, I made another kind of decision. I started dismantling Dorian's empire from the inside, not by destroying it, but by changing what it was allowed to be. I took the network of nightclubs and private venues that served as laundering hubs and converted them into legitimate training centers, self-defense classes, youth programs, a robotics lab funded under the Veil Foundation. The press praised the philanthropy. The underworld snarled about betrayal. I did not care about either reaction. Dorian protested, insisting we were weakening ourselves. I said, "We are weakening our enemy's excuses." He called me naive. I called him addicted to war. The shift changed our internal culture faster than Dorian expected. Men who had once celebrated brutality now wore uniforms with name tags and taught teenagers how to fall without breaking bones. Women who had once been hired as decor became managers with budgets. The network's money stopped smelling like fear and began to smell like paperwork, which is the cleanest scent violence can have. Dorian hated the loss of his old world, but even he could not deny the benefit. Legitimate fronts brought political protection, and protection buys time. Lucien, from his apartment near the academy, another gift I arranged, because freedom needed a physical address, began to study aerospace engineering with the intensity of a man building an escape route. He filled his shelves with magazines about propulsion and orbit mechanics. He did not speak about dreams out loud. After the hospital, I moved like a knife with a chipped edge. The city's predators sensed it immediately. Old captains who once saluted me began to forget my calls. Friendly politicians returned messages slower. Even the estate's dogs watched me with suspicious intelligence, as if they knew the scent of power had thinned. Dorian, who had never truly accepted being leashed, started circling again. He invited former lieutenants to dinner and spoke too loudly about tradition. He also began to hover near Lucien with a tenderness that felt rehearsed, offering gifts that were really surveillance devices, praising Lucien's improvement as if his body were a product line finally meeting quotas. Lucien endured it with a polite blankness that fooled his father and nobody else. I adapted by doing what I had always done before. Combat aptitude made me arrogant. I built systems instead of relying on my fists. I moved money through visible channels, created independent oversight boards for our foundation, and brought in auditors who did not fear the Veil name because they had their own empires, made of laws and public opinion. I hired a journalist with a feral sense of ethics, Nadia Reeve, and paid her to investigate my own organization. She looked at me like I was insane. I told her, "If you can find my weaknesses, my enemies already have." Nadia's articles, published under the Foundation's banner, exposed small crimes and punished mid-level parasites, which had a secondary effect. It told the city that the Veil machine was changing gears. People who hate you will still hate you, but fewer of them will dare to shoot you if they suspect a spotlight might turn on afterward. Lucien noticed the shift in me before anyone else. One evening in his apartment near the academy, he watched me limp to the window and adjust the blinds with a carefulness I would have once mocked. "You're counting exits," he said. I did not pretend otherwise. "You taught me that plans survive longer than muscles," I replied. He sat on the edge of the sofa, shoulders hunched, and asked the question he had avoided for months. "Did you trade something for me?" The words were neutral, but his fingers worried the seam of his sleeve until the fabric whitened. I met his eyes and answered with the only truth that would not become a chain. "I chose you," I said. "That's all you need to know." He held my gaze for a long time, then nodded once, as if filing the statement away to repay later in a currency he hadn't invented yet. Hannah got pulled into our orbit more firmly after the accident, not by romance, but by stubborn empathy. She started visiting the training centers I'd opened, first to practice self-defense, then to tutor kids whose parents worked 2 jobs, then to organize a donation drive for concussion helmets and lab kits. She was too young to understand how dangerous altruism could be in a city built on leverage. That made her brave in a way even Lucien respected. I taught her how to throw a punch without breaking her wrist, and how to read a room without flinching. Lucien watched every lesson from a corner, pretending to study a tablet. When Hannah teased him about being overprotective, he claimed he was simply monitoring for quality control. I watched his ears flush and thought, with private amusement, that trauma does not erase adolescence. It just makes it wear armor. The attempted drunk driver incident stopped looking accidental when Nadia came back with a folder full of quiet horrors. The driver's bank account had received a deposit the morning of the crash, routed through shell companies that linked back to a biotech firm called Eterna Renewal. Eterna's board included a familiar name under an alias, Dorian Veil. That connection made my stomach feel like it had swallowed ice. I confronted Dorian in his study, laying the folder on his desk like a weapon. "Explain," I said. He did not bother with full denial. He bothered with the kind of half-truth that is worse because it assumes you are stupid. "Eterna invested in experimental therapies," he said. "Lucien needed options. Lucien needed a father," I snapped. Dorian's eyes narrowed. "Don't pretend you understand family," he hissed. You're an outsider with good hands. I leaned closer, voice low. Outsiders see the patterns. Insiders normalize, I said. And the pattern here is that you treat your son like a resource. His expression stayed calm, but his pulse jumped in his neck, and I knew I had struck something true. After that confrontation, the coup attempt arrived on schedule. A group of Dorian's old captains tried to seize one of the training centers at night, expecting to find unarmed instructors and scared teenagers. They found Nadia live streaming from the lobby, a dozen parents on the sidewalk, and city police already en route, because the Foundation's new security protocol flagged unauthorized entries and auto-notified authorities. Dorian's men panicked at the witnesses. They could not shoot their way out without becoming headlines. I walked into the lobby on my bad leg, carrying no gun, only a tablet. You can leave, I told them, or you can stay and become evidence. The captain in front sneered and stepped toward me. My body screamed as I moved, but I still had training and a lifetime of ugly improvisation. I used his momentum, hooked his arm, and slammed him into the reception desk hard enough to rattle teeth. It hurt me more than it hurt him. And that was the point. Strength is not the same as safety, I said through clenched teeth. Get out. They fled, and the police arrived to collect names and fingerprints. By dawn, Dorian's remaining loyalists understood that the rules had changed. We were no longer operating in the dark. Lucien came to the training center the next day, saw the cracked desk, saw the bruises blooming on my forearm, and went very still. He did not ask who did it. He already knew the answer lived in his father's shadow. You shouldn't take hits for other people, he said, anger too controlled. I answered, sometimes taking one hit prevents 100. He stared at me as if trying to decide whether the sentence was wisdom or self-destruction. Then he said, if you keep paying for everyone, you'll run out. The warning was not a threat. It was fear wearing a suit. I put a hand on his shoulder. Careful. Because touch with Lucien had always been a negotiation. Then help me build a world where payment is cheaper, I said. His throat moved. I am, he replied. And for a moment the boy who once cried on command looked heartbreakingly sincere. That winter, Lucien and Hannah dragged me to the planetarium on a night the city's air was unusually clear. The dome filled with stars, simulated but still beautiful. And Lucien sat with his head tipped back as if gravity was optional. He spoke quietly, not to impress Hannah, not to challenge me, but because the dark made honesty easier. In the book, he said, almost mocking himself, I was supposed to become a tyrant. My skin prickled. You remember the book? I asked. He glanced sideways. I found fragments, he admitted. Old drafts on Father's server. He kept them like a script. The implication made my stomach twist. Dorian had been reading his own family like a prophecy, and following it because it excused his worst impulses. Lucien continued, voice thin with contempt. The tyrant version of me never leaves the city. He never learns anything except revenge. Hannah's hand found Lucien's in the dark, and Lucien did not pull away. What do you want to learn? I asked. Lucien exhaled. How to leave orbit and not fall, he said. Under the artificial stars, the module's counter ticked again, as if even it could not deny the power of a simple dream named out loud. On his 17th birthday, I gave him a long box wrapped in plain paper. Hannah attended the small dinner, sitting stiffly at first, until I told her to stop treating my dining table like a courtroom. Lucien opened the box and froze. Inside was a scale model of a vintage rocket plane, the exact limited-run piece he had stared at during an exhibition months earlier. He looked up at me, shock naked on his face. I shrugged. You can't spend your whole life imagining the sky from behind glass, I said. Choose a direction and start building. His throat bobbed as he swallowed words he didn't know how to release. Thank you, he managed, voice rough. The module flashed. Affection plus 20, total 66. For the first time, the number looked like a ladder, rather than a prank. 2 days later, I left for a charity tour in the mountain districts, bringing supplies to schools that the government remembered only during elections. Dorian insisted on security convoys. I allowed it because arrogance is not bravery. The trip went well until the return route, where the road curved along a cliff like a ribbon. Gunfire erupted from the tree line. Our lead vehicle exploded, flipping into a ditch. The attack was precise, aimed not at the convoy as a whole but at my car. Someone wanted me removed cleanly enough that the rest of the network could be reclaimed. I dragged myself out through broken glass, took a bullet through the calf, and rolled down an embankment into rain-soaked brush. The world turned into mud, pine needles, and the copper taste of blood. I found a shallow cave and pressed cloth to my leg, cursing the fact that I was no longer the apex predator I had been. Voices moved through the rain above me, searching. Flashlights swept like white knives. I recognized one silhouette even before it stepped close. Dorian Vale, wearing a storm jacket, moving with the calm of a man who had decided that betrayal was simply another strategy meeting. So, he had been waiting for my weakness. He had watched me trade strength for Lucien's life, and he had finally seen an opening. I bit back a laugh that would have sounded like hysteria. The module whispered, almost smug, "Survival probability. Below 5%. I replied inside my head, "Then you'd better stop pretending you're neutral." The module did not like being addressed as if it had motives, but it had motives, and I had begun to suspect them long before the ambush. The mission change had been too convenient. The conversion rates had been predatory. Every time I gained leverage, the module tightened the leash. I spoke into the darkness of my own mind with the clarity that comes when death is standing close enough to hear you. "You attached yourself to me without authorization," I said. "You are running this world for your own reward, not the supposed administrator. If I die, I will force an audit." The module responded with static, then a clipped denial. I pushed harder. "I know you can signal upstream. Don't lie. Help me survive this, or I burn you with me." Above, Dorian's men were closing in. Dorian's voice cut through the rain. "Search the rocks. She can't have gone far." A flashlight beam slid toward the cave mouth. I held my breath, pain roaring in my leg. The module hesitated, and in that hesitation I heard fear machine fear. But real enough, it finally said, "Minimal interference permitted if framed as probability smoothing." The air around me shivered. The next gunshot cracked, aimed at my chest, and the bullet deflected by an impossible fraction, tearing through my shoulder instead. White-hot pain flared, but I stayed alive. That was all I needed. Rescue arrived like thunder in human form. Shots answered shots from the ridgeline, disciplined and fast. Dorian cursed, surprised for the first time in years. A figure sprinted through the rain and slid into the cave on one knee, breath harsh, eyes bright with fury, and something worse, devotion sharpened into weaponry. Lucien. He wore dark, tactical gear, hair plastered to his forehead, and he looked older than 17 in the way trauma ages people. "Mira," he said my real name, the one he had learned by accident from a file he shouldn't have seen. He checked my wounds with quick hands, wrapping my leg, sealing my shoulder, working like someone who had practiced the idea of losing me and refused it. I tried to speak. He pressed 2 fingers to my lips. "Save your breath," he ordered. And there was no softness in the command. It terrified me, and it relieved me, because it meant he had finally chosen a side. The module pinged once, quietly. Affection +9. Lucien handed me to medics and stood up, turning toward the storm as if the storm owed him answers. I grabbed his sleeve weakly. "Don't," I rasped. He looked down, and for a second his eyes were the boy's eyes again, hungry and wounded. "He's mine," he said. And I realized he was not talking about Dorian's body so much as the debt Dorian had placed inside Lucien's bones. Lucien walked out into the rain with a squad at his back. I was carried away, half-conscious, listening to the distant stutter of gunfire and the heavier silence between bursts. Later, when the bleeding was controlled and I could think without the world tilting, I received a recording from one of my people. It showed a clearing slick with mud, Dorian and Lucien facing each other while their men held position like statues. Dorian smiled, crooked and proud, as if even betrayal was a lesson. "My son," he called. "You finally came to claim the throne." Lucien's voice on the recording was low and flat. "You don't get to call me that," he said. Dorian's smile faltered. Lucien continued. Each word measured. "You drugged me as a child. You signed my blood to your laboratory partners. You called it treatment. You needed a genetic match for your longevity trials, and you thought a son was an organ bank with a heartbeat." The camera shook slightly as the person holding it swallowed. Dorian's face hardened into denial. Lucien lifted his chin. "I remember the needles," he said. "I remember blackouts. I remember you ordering the doctors to increase the dose because I was inconveniently alive." Dorian's voice turned sharp. "Everything I did was for the family," Lucien answered. "No, everything you did was for your fear of dying. The recording ended before any final outcome, because some endings do not belong on a phone screen. What I know, from later reports, is that Dorian was taken alive. Lucien had every reason to kill him and chose not to, which told me Hannah's warmth and my stubbornness had both done their work. Dorian was handed to federal investigators with enough evidence to make the state pretend it had always planned to arrest him. His network's remaining violent branches were cut away like gangrene. The legitimate parts training centers, labs, contracts that involved saving rather than threatening, remained because Lucien insisted on building instead of burning. When I returned to the estate weeks later, limping but upright, Lucien waited in the library, the same library where he had once tried to ruin me with spilled broth. He stood by the window, watching rain slide down glass in slow lines. Without turning, he said, "You should have let me stay in the cave with you," I answered. "You should have been at school worrying about exams." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "I was," he said. "Then I realized I prefer worrying about you." The confession was awkward, raw, and too honest to be manipulation. I sat carefully in a chair, feeling the old fear of repeated patterns. Savior, dependency, tragedy. I said, "Affection isn't ownership, Lucien." He turned then, eyes steady. "I know," he replied. "It's a choice." The module flashed a bright panel in my vision, as cheerful as a parasite announcing it has eaten enough. Objective threshold achieved. Affection. Maximum range confirmed. Termination risk removed. Prepare for extraction or continuation. It offered 2 buttons. Leave world or remain. After everything, the choice should have been simple. Go home, if home still existed, or at least go somewhere with fewer guns. But I thought of Lucien's first genuine smile at the academy gate, of Hannah's hands bandaging his knuckles, of the teenagers at our training center learning to fall safely, of the strange fact that I had turned a criminal fortress into a place where ordinary people could breathe. I had never been good at leaving before the job was finished. I also thought of the module itself, still coiled inside my head, still hungry for reward. I asked it one final question. "If I choose to remain," I said, "do you detach?" It responded with legalistic evasions. I smiled, despite the pain in my shoulder, because I had learned its weakness. It hated audits more than it hated me. I said, "Then detach now, or I press the signal you fear." The module sputtered. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, like a hand trying to hold onto my skull from the inside. Then it released with a pop of sudden silence so complete it made the world louder. The clock tick, the distant footsteps, Lucien's breathing. For the first time since waking in this world, my mind was entirely my own. Lucien watched me closely. "Did something change?" he asked. I looked at him, at the boy who had tried to frame me and the young man who had dragged an army through rain to save me, and I answered honestly. "Yes," I said. "The part of me that was being managed just got fired." He tilted his head, processing. "Good," he said. "I don't like sharing." Hannah, who had entered quietly with a tray of tea, rolled her eyes at him and told him to stop being dramatic. Lucien pretended to be offended. The exchange was ordinary, and that ordinariness felt like a victory. If you need a lesson from this report, take the simplest one. Violence raises children who speak violence as a first language, and love, real love, the kind that sets boundaries and opens doors, teaches them new vocabulary. I did not cure Lucien by being gentle. I cured him by being consistent, by being strong when strength was required, and by being willing to weaken myself to keep him alive when the universe demanded payment. I did not redeem Dorian. Dorian ruined himself with his own choices, and the best I could do was stop him from ruining his son, too. Lucien did not become a saint. He became something rarer in a world like ours, a man who understands his darkness and chooses not to worship it. Tomorrow, Lucien leaves for a summer program at an aerospace institute overseas. He will learn how to calculate fuel ratios and design wings that do not shear off in wind shear. Hannah will go with him on scholarship. She swears she is there for the math, and he swears he does not care, and both of them are lying in the same hopeful direction. I will remain here, running the foundation, rewriting contracts, and making sure the places that once sold fear now sell safety. In the drawer of my desk is an old pistol magazine, empty, kept as a reminder of the first day I refused to follow canon. If another module ever tries to write you into a corner, remember this. You can tear the page. You can build a door where a wall was supposed to be. You can, if you're stubborn enough, turn a villain's origin into a flight plan.